In 1940, a British officer charged into battle carrying a Scottish broadsword, a longbow and bagpipes. While his fellow soldiers carried rifles and grenades, Lieutenant John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, known as Mad Jack, was fighting World War II like it was the Middle Ages. His commanding officers thought he was insane. His enemies thought he was supernatural. His men thought he was the bravest lunatic they'd ever served under. They were all correct. Jack Churchill stood on the beach at Dunkirk in May 1940, chaos erupting around him as the German Wehrmacht closed in on the trapped British Expeditionary Force. Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were desperately trying to evacuate across the English Channel. Ships were burning, planes screamed overhead. Men were dying by the dozens. And Mad Jack was playing the bagpipes. "Sir, with respect, what the hell are you doing?" a sergeant shouted over the din of gunfire and explosions. "Giving the lads something to march to," Churchill replied calmly, his fingers working the pipes even as bullets kicked up sand around his feet. "Can't have them retreating without proper accompaniment, can we?" This wasn't eccentricity for show. This was who Jack Churchill actually was, a man so fundamentally out of sync with the modern world that he'd decided to fight the 20th century's most mechanized war using medieval weapons and tactics. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. Born in 1906 in Hong Kong to British parents, John Churchill grew up reading stories of knights and ancient warriors. While other boys played with toy soldiers, young Jack was obsessed with swords and bows. His family thought it was a phase. It wasn't. Churchill attended the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, where instructors quickly realized they had a peculiar cadet on their hands. During training exercises, Churchill would sometimes refuse to use his issued rifle, instead fashioning improvised bows and arrows from materials he found in the woods. "Lieutenant Churchill, explain to me why you're carrying that bow," a training officer once demanded. "Sir, it's more sporting," Churchill replied. "Gives the enemy a fair chance." "This isn't about sport, Lieutenant. This is about killing efficiently." "With respect, sir, I disagree. If we're going to fight, we might as well do it with style." After graduating, Churchill served briefly in Burma before retiring from the army in 1936. But retirement for Mad Jack didn't mean settling into a quiet life. Instead, he became a professional male model in London and a competitive archer, even representing Great Britain at the World Archery Championships. He also learned to play the bagpipes, much to the dismay of his neighbours. When World War II broke out in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined the army. He was 33 years old, older than most soldiers, but he was in peak physical condition and possessed combat experience that most officers lacked. The British Army desperately needed experienced leaders. They got Mad Jack instead, or perhaps in addition to. Churchill was assigned to the Manchester Regiment and posted to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force. His fellow officers quickly realized they were dealing with someone unusual when Churchill showed up to his first briefing carrying a basket-hilted Scottish claymore sword. "Lieutenant Churchill, why are you carrying a sword?" his battalion commander asked, rubbing his temples. "In case we get close enough to use it, sir. We have rifles for close combat." "Rifles are so impersonal, sir. A sword requires you to look a man in the eye." The commander started to argue, then stopped. There was something in Churchill's eyes, not madness exactly, but an absolute certainty that made arguing seem pointless. "Fine, just don't get yourself killed doing something stupid." "No promises, sir." During the early months of the war, the phony war period when little actual fighting occurred, Churchill's eccentric behavior was tolerated as harmless. He'd march his men while playing the bagpipes. He'd practice archery on the shooting range, drawing amused looks from soldiers firing Lee-Enfield rifles. He'd sharpen his sword every night while reading Norse sagas. Then the real war started, and everyone stopped laughing. In May 1940, Germany launched its blitzkrieg attack through the Low Countries. The speed and ferocity of the assault caught the Allies completely off guard. Modern tank warfare, dive bombers, and coordinated infantry assaults shattered the British and French defensive lines in days. Churchill's unit was ordered to conduct a fighting retreat toward the coast, trying to buy time for the evacuation at Dunkirk. During one particularly desperate ambush near the town of Lepinette, Churchill's squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire. The position was too well defended. Standard tactics called for artillery support or flanking maneuvers, both of which would take time they didn't have. Mad Jack had a different approach. He stood up from cover, raised his longbow, drew back an arrow, and began walking toward the German position. His sergeant thought he'd lost his mind. The Germans thought they were hallucinating. Churchill released his arrow at 30 yards. The shaft flew true, striking a German NCO in the neck. The man went down, and his squad stared in absolute confusion at the medieval projectile protruding from their sergeant's throat. In that moment of shocked hesitation, Churchill charged forward, screaming a battle cry and drawing his sword. His men, infected by their commander's insanity or bravery, perhaps both, charged with him. The Germans, already demoralized and deeply confused about being attacked by a man with a sword, broke and ran. Churchill's squad captured 42 prisoners and a mortar position. The only British casualty was a private who'd sprained his ankle trying to keep up with Mad Jack. When they returned to friendly lines, Churchill's commanding officer demanded an explanation. "Sir, the Germans weren't expecting medieval tactics," Churchill explained, cleaning blood off his sword. "Gave us the advantage of surprise. You charged a machine gun nest with a bow and arrow. And a sword, sir. Don't forget the sword. Churchill, you're either the bravest man in the British Army or the craziest." "Thank you, sir. I choose to take that as a compliment." Word of Mad Jack's exploit spread through the British forces at Dunkirk. In a retreat marked by desperation and defeat, Churchill's medieval charge was the kind of story that soldiers clung to, proof that audacity and courage still mattered in an age of mechanized warfare. After Dunkirk, Churchill was transferred to a commando unit, No. 3 Commando, an elite force designed for raids on Nazi-occupied Europe. If anyone thought commando training would make Churchill more conventional, they were deeply mistaken. Instead, it gave him an official license to be even more outrageous. Commando units prided themselves on unconventional tactics, surprise attacks, and operating outside normal military doctrine. For Mad Jack, this was like finding his natural habitat. He immediately began training his men in archery, sword fighting, and bagpipe appreciation, the last of which was significantly less popular than the first two. "Sir, when will we ever need to know how to use a sword?" one of his commandos asked during training. "When you run out of bullets and the enemy is close enough to smell," Churchill replied, demonstrating a disemboweling strike on a practice dummy. "Also, it's excellent for morale. Nothing says we're going to win like a commanding officer carrying a sword." On December 27, 1941, Churchill led a commando raid on the Norwegian island of Vågsøy. The objective was to destroy fish oil factories the Germans were using to manufacture glycerin for explosives and to draw German forces away from other theaters. As the landing craft approached the beach, Churchill stood at the bow playing the March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes. His men had learned to accept this as normal. The Germans defending the island had not. When the ramp dropped, Churchill was the first off, sword in hand, still playing the pipes. He charged up the beach toward a German bunker, screaming what witnesses later described as either a Viking battle cry or possibly just very enthusiastic Scottish cursing. A German soldier, confronted by a bagpipe-playing maniac with a sword running directly at him, did what any reasonable person would do. He froze in complete confusion. In that moment of hesitation, Churchill was on him. The sword flashed once and the soldier went down. Churchill's commandos stormed the German positions, taking prisoners and destroying the oil factories. The raid was a complete success. Churchill personally captured 42 Germans, a number that became something of his trademark, by charging their position alone, sword drawn, bagpipes wailing. One German officer, when asked years later about being captured, said through a translator, "We thought he was some kind of Scottish demon, a man with a sword and those terrible pipes. We didn't know whether to shoot him or run from him. In the end, we just surrendered because nothing in our training prepared us for whatever he was." The raid on WWII made Churchill a legend in commando circles. His commanding officer recommended him for the Military Cross, writing in the citation, "Lieutenant Churchill's complete disregard for his own safety and unconventional tactical approach resulted in the successful completion of the mission with minimal casualties. Also, he has a sword." We're not sure if that's relevant, but it seemed worth mentioning. In July 1943, Churchill was promoted to Major and participated in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. While most officers commanded from behind the lines with maps and radios, Mad Jack led from the front with his sword and bagpipes. During the assault on a German-held town, Churchill's unit encountered heavy resistance. Machine gun nests and fortified positions made a frontal assault suicidal. Churchill studied the situation for approximately 30 seconds, then announced, "Right, I'll go first." Before anyone could stop him, he drew his sword, began playing the bagpipes, and marched down the main street toward the German positions. His men, convinced their commander had finally gone completely insane, nonetheless followed him. What else could they do? The Germans, confronted once again by the bagpipe-playing sword maniac, had a crisis of morale. This wasn't how modern warfare was supposed to work. They'd trained for tanks and artillery, not medieval warriors. Several German soldiers later admitted they thought they were hallucinating from heat stroke. Churchill's unit took the town with surprisingly light casualties. The Germans, psychologically broken by the sheer audacity of a man attacking them with a sword while playing the bagpipes, surrendered en masse. But Mad Jack's most legendary exploit came later, in September 1943, during the Allied landings at Salerno, Italy. Churchill and his commandos were ordered to capture a German artillery position overlooking the beach. The position was heavily fortified and manned by seasoned Wehrmacht troops. Intelligence suggested at least 50 defenders with machine guns and mortars. Churchill decided 50 was a reasonable number and volunteered to take the position with just his corporal and 6 privates. His superior officers said absolutely not. Churchill said he was going anyway. They compromised. He could take 12 men total. On the night of the assault, Churchill led his tiny force through rough terrain in complete darkness, moving silently toward the German position. When they were close enough to hear the Germans talking, Churchill stood up, drew his sword, and began playing the bagpipes. The Germans opened fire immediately, tracers lighting up the night. Churchill kept playing, walking calmly toward the position as bullets whipped past him. His men, inspired or terrified or both, charged behind him. Churchill reached the German trenches and leaped down among the defenders, sword flashing in the darkness. The fighting was brutal and close. Men struggled hand to hand in the narrow trenches. Churchill fought with his sword, his men with rifles and bayonets and fists. When dawn broke, Churchill and his men held the position. They'd captured 42 German prisoners, Mad Jack's lucky number again, and eliminated the artillery threat to the beach. Churchill had a slight wound on his left arm from a bayonet and a bullet hole through his jacket, but was otherwise unharmed. His commanding officer visited the captured position later that morning. "Major Churchill, you absolute madman. You took a fortified position with 12 men, armed with a sword, while playing the bagpipes." "Actually, sir, I stopped playing the pipes when we reached the trenches," Churchill corrected. "Too difficult to fight and play simultaneously." "I've tried. That's your concern. Not that you charged a machine gun nest with a medieval weapon." "Sir, I've found that enemies rarely expect sword attacks in the modern era. It gives one a considerable tactical advantage." The officer started to respond, stopped, and just walked away, shaking his head. Churchill's war in Italy continued with similar exploits. He led raids, ambushes, and assaults, always with his sword and often with his bagpipes. His men developed an almost superstitious faith in his invincibility. Surely, they reasoned, A man crazy enough to bring a sword to a gunfight must be protected by God, luck, or sheer audacity. But luck runs out for everyone eventually. In May 1944, Churchill and his commandos were fighting in Yugoslavia, supporting partisan forces against the Germans. During an assault on a German position on the island of Brač, Churchill and 6 of his men became separated from the main force and surrounded. They fought through the night, ammunition running low, situation desperate. Churchill knew they couldn't win, but he could make the Germans pay dearly for capturing them. He drew his sword and prepared for a final charge. One of his men grabbed his arm. "Sir, we're out of ammunition. We can't fight." "Speak for yourself, Corporal. I have a perfectly good sword." "Sir, there's at least 30 of them." "Then some of them will go home disappointed." Before Churchill could charge, a German grenade landed in their position. The explosion knocked Churchill unconscious. When he woke, he was a prisoner of war, his sword confiscated, his bagpipes destroyed. For Mad Jack Churchill, this was a fate possibly worse than death. The Germans, after reviewing his service record and realizing exactly who they'd captured, sent Churchill to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He was deemed too dangerous and unconventional to be held in a regular POW camp. The Germans correctly assessed that keeping Mad Jack in a normal facility would result in escape attempts, rebellion, and general chaos. Sachsenhausen was designed to be escape-proof. Prisoners were closely watched, roll calls were frequent, and security was intense. Churchill studied the camp for approximately 2 weeks before attempting his first escape. He tunneled under the wire in September 1944 and made it several miles before being recaptured. The Germans, impressed by his audacity, transferred him to an even more secure facility in Austria, prisoner of war camp Stalag 16-A. Churchill escaped from there too in April 1945 by simply walking out through a drainage pipe during a storm when guards were seeking shelter. He traveled 150 miles through the Alps, navigating by stars and living off stolen vegetables from farms, before reaching American lines in Italy. The American soldiers who found him, muddy, exhausted, but somehow still maintaining a military bearing, didn't quite know what to make of him. "British officer, Major John Churchill, reporting," he announced to the confused American sergeant. "Sir, you escaped from a German POW camp and walked across the Alps?" "Yes. Also, I don't suppose you have my sword." "The Germans took it when they captured me. I'm rather attached to it." "Your sword?" "Sir, we're in the middle of a war." "I'm aware, Sergeant. I've been fighting it for 5 years now." "Have you seen my sword or haven't you?" The Americans sent Churchill back to Britain, where he immediately volunteered to be sent to the Pacific Theatre to fight the Japanese. The British Army, recognizing that Mad Jack was never going to stop being Mad Jack, agreed. They sent him to Burma in May 1945. Churchill was en route when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender in August 1945. When Churchill heard the news, he was genuinely disappointed. "Those bloody Americans," he complained to a fellow officer. "They ended the war before I could fight the Japanese properly. Could have gone on for years if they'd just stuck to conventional weapons." "Sir, the atomic bombs saved potentially millions of lives." Yes, I suppose, still, would have been nice to have a crack at them with the sword." After the war, Churchill didn't settle into peaceful retirement. Instead, he served in Palestine during the British Mandate, became a qualified parachutist at age 43, and later served as an instructor at Land Air Warfare School in Australia. He also took up surfing, becoming one of the first people to ride the tidal bore on the River Severn in England. Into his 60s, Churchill would commute to work in London by throwing his briefcase out the window of the moving train before it stopped at the station, then jumping out himself. When questioned about this unusual commuting method, he explained, "It's faster than waiting for the train to stop completely." Mad Jack Churchill retired from the military in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He'd earned the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross with Bar, and the French Croix de Guerre. He was one of the most highly decorated British soldiers of World War II. But the decorations don't really capture who Jack Churchill was. The medals and citations talk about bravery and tactical innovation. They don't mention the bagpipes or the sword or the absolute refusal to fight a modern war in a modern way. Churchill lived until 1996, dying at the age of 89. In interviews during his later years, he reflected on his wartime experiences with the same mix of pride and disappointment that characterized his reaction to the war's end. "People always ask if I was afraid," he said in a 1985 interview. "Of course I was afraid. Any man who says he wasn't afraid in combat is either a liar or insane. But fear is just another obstacle to overcome, like barbed wire or a locked door. You acknowledge it and then you move past it." "But why the sword and bow?" the interviewer asked. "Why not just fight with modern weapons like everyone else?" Churchill thought about this for a long moment. "Because wars are won by men, not weapons. A rifle is just metal and wood. What matters is the will of the man holding it. I chose the sword and bow because they required more skill, more courage, more commitment. Every time I drew that sword, I was making a statement. I'm willing to fight you face to face, blade to blade." That kind of personal commitment breaks enemy morale far more effectively than bullets fired from a distance. But it was incredibly dangerous. "Of course it was dangerous." Churchill laughed. "It was war. Everything about it was dangerous. I simply chose to be dangerous in my own way." Mad Jack Churchill represents something that seemed impossible during World War II, but somehow became real. A man from another era, when courage, skill and spirit mattered more than technology or numbers. He wasn't supposed to succeed. His approach wasn't supposed to work, but it did. Modern analysts looking back at Churchill's actions still struggle to understand how he achieved what he did. On paper, his methods shouldn't have worked. Marching forward with only traditional tools and music instead of standard weapons shouldn't have been effective. Yet he kept proving everyone wrong. Churchill understood something that modern strategy often forgets, that mindset and psychology matter just as much as physical strength. When you act with fearless creativity and confidence, you disrupt the expectations of everyone around you. And in that confusion, you can change the outcome. Those who faced Mad Jack weren't just up against another soldier. They were facing the shock of witnessing something totally unexpected. His old-fashioned courage and spirit challenged their sense of what was possible. And once that belief cracked, he had already won half the battle. His teammates followed him because he made them believe again that confidence and boldness could overcome fear. When your leader charges ahead with total conviction and comes back victorious, you begin to think maybe the rules can be rewritten. Maybe attitude can reshape reality. Maybe we can win this. That belief, that contagious energy, was Churchill's true power. Not his gear or his music, but his unstoppable confidence that he could succeed on his own terms. After his passing, those who served beside him gathered to share memories. What they remembered most wasn't fear or admiration. It was inspiration. Serving under him made them feel capable of extraordinary things. "Jack made you feel like you were part of a legend," one of them said. "Like we weren't just living through history, but shaping it. When he stepped forward with that unshakable smile, you didn't think about danger. You thought about courage, loyalty, and honor." That perhaps is Mad Jack Churchill's greatest legacy. Not his victories, but his example. He proved that individual character still matters, even in an age driven by machines and numbers. That human spirit, courage, and audacity can still stand out and make a difference. There's a memorial plaque in Scotland where Churchill lived later in life. It doesn't mention his trademark sword or bagpipes. It simply says, "Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, DSO and Bar, MC and Bar, fought World War II in his own style, 906-1996. That phrase, in his own style, says it all. In a time of mass production and mechanical precision, he proved that one person's courage and individuality could still shine bright. Historians still debate whether he was fearless or simply unconventional. Those who knew him best believed it was both, and that one couldn't exist without the other. Was Jack Churchill unusual? Someone once asked one of his former comrades. Probably, the man said, but he was exactly the kind of unusual the world needed. And that's the story of Mad Jack Churchill, the man who fought the modern world with the spirit of an ancient warrior and reminded everyone that courage never goes out of style. The real story is that when the world went mad with industrial slaughter and mechanized death, when warfare became about factories and logistics and breaking the enemy's will through sheer material advantage, one man decided to fight differently. To fight like wars was still about individual warriors testing themselves against impossible odds. And somehow, impossibly, gloriously, it worked. Mad Jack Churchill ended his life believing that World War II could have gone on longer if not for those bloody Americans and their atomic bombs. But he didn't mourn the end of war. He mourned the end of his war, fought on his own terms with his own weapons according to his own insane code of honor. Standing on a beach in Scotland in his final years, looking out over the cold Atlantic waters, Churchill supposedly reflected on his wartime service. A journalist asked him if he had any regrets. "Only one," Churchill replied. "I never did get that sword back from the Germans."